The auction hammer had barely fallen before the men of Caldwell, Kansas erupted into cheers so loud they rattled the glass in the windows of the First Territorial Bank. And not a single one of those celebrating men noticed that the quiet rancher standing at the back of the room had gone pale as bleached bone. It was the autumn of 1879, and Caldwell sat right on the edge of what the newspapers liked to call civilization. Though anyone who had spent more than a week in that town knew civilization was a generous word for a place where justice was whatever the strongest man decided it was that morning. The cattle trade ran hard through Caldwell, and money moved like floodwater fast, unpredictable, and capable of drowning anyone caught without high enough ground. Irene Talmadge had been standing in front of that auction block for 23 minutes before the final bid was called, and in those 23 minutes she had fought harder than most men fight in a lifetime. She was 31 years old, with dark hair pinned beneath a sun-bleached bonnet and brown eyes that could cut through a man's pretense the way a good knife cuts through butter. She wore a dress that had been let out at the seams twice, not because she was careless, but because she had spent the last 2 years putting every spare penny back into the land her late husband, Thomas Talmadge, had broken his back over for 6 years before a fever took him in the February of 1878. That land, 420 acres of rolling grassland fed by Bluff Creek, with a solid timber house and 2 good wells, was everything. It was her children's future. It was the promise she had made over Thomas's grave in the frozen February ground. It was hers, or it had been until the bank called in the note. The note had been legitimate. She understood that. Thomas had borrowed against the property to buy a second herd in the spring of 1877, gambling that cattle prices would hold through the following winter. They had not. He had died before he could see the full damage, and Irene had spent 18 months selling off stock piece by piece, taking in laundry from the town women, even selling the silver candlesticks her mother had sent from Ohio, all to service the interest. But interest was a hungry animal, and the principal had remained untouched. When the bank, run by a man named Gerard Hollis, who wore his prosperity the way some men wear a gun, openly, and with the specific intention of making others feel unsafe, announced that the Talmadge property would be auctioned to satisfy the outstanding debt of $412, Irene had walked into that bank and told Hollis she intended to bid. Hollis had smiled at her the way a cat smiles at something smaller than itself. She had gone to every person she trusted in Caldwell. She had borrowed $40 from a woman named Mee Dupree, who ran the seamstress shop on Maple Street. She had sold her second horse, a bay gelding that Thomas had named Confidence, for $65. She had written to her brother in Wichita and received a letter back that was long on sympathy and short on cash. She had scraped together, by the morning of the auction, $320. It was not enough, and she had known it was not enough, but she had walked into that room anyway because she did not know how to do anything else. The room had been full of men. Cattlemen, speculators, a man she recognized as a land agent from Wichita who wore a suit too fine for Caldwell's dust. And in the back, near the door, a man she knew only slightly, Walter Shelby, who ran a mid-sized cattle operation 8 miles south of town on a property he had built himself from nothing over the course of 7 years. He was 36 years old, broad-shouldered in the way that comes from actual work rather than performance of it, with dark hair going silver at the temples and a face that had been shaped by weather and thought in roughly equal measure. He had a reputation for being a straight dealer and a hard worker, and for being the sort of man who said almost nothing in social situations, not because he was unfriendly, but because he was careful. Words, in Walter Shelby's estimation, were like bullets better not wasted. Irene had noticed him when she walked in the vague way you notice furniture in a room you are too nervous to look at directly. She had not thought about him further. The auction had started at $200, which was an insult to the land's value, and everyone in the room knew it. The bids had climbed fast. The Wichita land agent pushed hard. A cattleman named Burl Ackerman, who had wanted that stretch of Bluff Creek frontage for 3 years, pushed harder. Irene had bid until her $320 was entirely committed, watching the number climb past it like a wagon going over a hill and disappearing from view. The final bid, $475, had come from the back of the room. The hammer had fallen. The cheering had started because everyone assumed it was either the land agent or Burl Ackerman who had taken the property, and the other men were congratulating the winner the way men do in rooms where power changes hands, and no one wants to be seen as having backed the losing side. Irene had stood very still at the front of that room with $320 in a worn leather pouch and felt the entire shape of her future collapse inward like a burning building. She had not cried. She would not have given that room the satisfaction. She had turned to leave, and that was when she had seen Walter Shelby's face. Every other man in the room was grinning, slapping someone on the back, already moving toward the door or toward Holly's desk to begin calculating what this meant for their own interests. Walter Shelby was standing absolutely still near the back wall, and his expression was not celebration. It was not triumph. It was something quieter and more complicated than either of those things, and Irene had been too stunned by the shock of losing to understand what she was looking at. She had walked past him without a word and pushed through the door into the cold October air. She had driven her wagon 3 miles out of town before she finally allowed herself to stop beside a cottonwood stand near the creek and press her forehead against her hands and breathe through the grief of it, methodically, the way you breathe through pain when there are children at home who cannot see you broken. Her children. Sarah, who was 9 and already had her father's stubborn cleverness. And Owen, who was 6 and still sometimes cried at night for a man he was beginning to forget the specifics of, though he remembered the feeling precisely. She had 2 weeks, according to the terms of the auction, before the new owner could take possession. 2 weeks to find somewhere to go and some way to explain to her children that the land their father had loved was no longer theirs. She was still sitting by that cottonwood stand 40 minutes later when she heard a horse approaching. She straightened immediately, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and turned to see Walter Shelby riding a good gray horse at a steady pace, pulling up a respectful distance away and removing his hat before he said anything at all. "Mrs. Talmadge," he said. She looked at him and said nothing, because she did not trust her voice yet, and also because she had not decided yet whether she wanted company. "I was the one who bid," he said. She had already known that, she realized from the way he had looked in that room, not triumphant, braced. "I know," she said. He held his hat in both hands and turned it once, a small nervous gesture entirely at odds with his general stillness. "I want to talk to you about the property," he said, "if you are willing." "I do not see that I have much negotiating leverage at the moment, Mr. Shelby," she said, and there was iron in her voice even through the grief. "No," he agreed. "That is not actually what I want to talk about." He paused. "Could I come down off this horse? I would rather say what I have to say without looking down at you." It was such an unexpectedly considerate thing to say that it caught her off guard. "Go ahead," she said. He dismounted, looped the gray's reins over a low branch, and came to stand near the wagon with his hat still in his hands. He was tall, she noticed, and he did not fill the space around him the way men who wanted to intimidate did. He occupied it precisely, no more. "I did not go to that auction intending to buy your land," he said. "I went because I heard Burl Ackerman talking the night before at the saloon about how he was going to get that Bluff Creek frontage for a price that would embarrass Holly's, and I did not like what I heard." Irene looked at him steadily. "What did you hear?" "I heard Ackerman and Holly's had an arrangement," Walter said. "The auction was meant to cap early. The price was meant to stay low. Ackerman would buy the property for half what it was worth, sell Holly's the mineral rights on the northern section, and you would lose 400 acres for barely enough to cover the note and nothing more." The cold in Irene's chest shifted into something sharper. "You are saying the auction was arranged." "I am saying I believe it was. I cannot prove it in a court of law, but I was not going to stand in that room and watch it happen without doing something. He met her eyes directly. So I bid. I kept bidding until Ackerman dropped out, which happened at 460. Then the land agent pushed it to 475, and I matched him. She was quiet for a long moment. The cottonwood leaves moved in the October wind with a dry, papery sound. "You spent $475 on my land," she said. "I did, to prevent an arrangement you could not prove." "Yes." She looked at him for a long time. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, as if he were being careful with the words. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said. "And because I have been watching you fight for this place for 2 years, and I did not think you deserved to lose it to a rigged game." "You have been watching me," she said slowly, not accusatory, more thoughtful. "Caldwell is a small town, Mrs. Talmadge." A slight flush moved under his weathered skin. "I do not mean that to sound strange. I mean I have noticed the way anyone notices. You are not easy to not notice." She was not sure what to do with that, so she set it aside. "What do you want in exchange for the property?" she asked. "I would like to give it back to you," he said. The words landed like a stone in still water, and Irene felt the ring spreading outward in her chest. Shock, and then something sharper and more dangerous than shock. "You would like to give it back," she said carefully. "I will deed it back to you for whatever you were able to raise. $320. I saw you bid." He turned his hat one more time. "You are $155 short of what I paid, and I am prepared to call that a loss I am willing to take." "I cannot accept that," she said, and she heard the fracture in her own voice and steadied herself against it. "Mrs. Talmadge, I will not be a charity case, Mr. Shelby. I have children who will grow up knowing how their mother kept this land. I will not have them grow up knowing someone gave it to them because their mother could not manage." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, not sympathy exactly, but recognition. As if he understood something about pride and stubbornness that he had not expected to meet in quite this form. "All right," he said. "Then let me suggest something different." She waited. "I run cattle," he said. "I have for 7 years. I have 2 hands who work my place, and in the spring and fall when I am moving cattle I could use a 3rd pair on the ground. The Talmadge land has the best Bluff Creek access in this section. I have been working around it for years." He paused. "What if you kept the land, and I used a portion of your creek access in exchange for a $155 credit against the property? A lease arrangement, legal and documented. You own the land outright. I get water rights on the North Bend for cattle movement twice a year." Irene looked at him. "You are constructing a way for me to keep my pride," she said. "I am constructing a way for both of us to get something we need," he said, but there was something honest in his eyes that did not pretend the transaction was purely mercenary. She thought about her children. She thought about the house her husband had built with his own hands, the 2 wells, the garden she had planted each spring in the belief that there would be another spring to plant in. "I want it in writing," she said. "Proper documentation, filed with the county clerk." "I would not have it any other way," he said, "and I want the creek access defined specifically. North Bend, cattle movement, April and October only, maximum herd size to be agreed upon." The corner of his mouth moved almost a smile. "You are a careful woman." "I have learned to be," she said. He rode back toward town, and Irene sat by the cottonwood stand for another 10 minutes before she allowed herself to feel what was actually happening inside her chest, which was something between relief, so profound it made her dizzy, and a confusion she did not yet have words for, centered around the image of a man with his hat in his hands and a flush on his cheekbones, telling her she was not easy to not notice. She drove home to her children and told them they were not going anywhere. Sarah had thrown her arms around her mother's waist, and Owen had asked if they could have cornbread for supper, and Irene had said yes to everything, and then stood in her kitchen and pressed her hand flat against the wooden wall and breathed until she was steady. The deed was transferred back to Irene Talmadge 3 days later, in a transaction documented by the county clerk with Walter Shelby's signature and Irene's, and a water rights lease that was precise enough to satisfy Irene's standards, which were considerable. Gerard Hollies had watched the whole thing from his office doorway with an expression like a man who has bitten into an apple and found it unexpectedly bitter. Burl Ackerman had been less subtle. He had come to Walter at the livery the following morning and told him, with a degree of directness that stopped just short of threat, that he had made an enemy. Walter had said, "You were an enemy already, Burl. I just did not bother to tell you." Ackerman had not forgotten this, but that is a story for later. The arrangement meant that Walter Shelby came onto the Talmadge property for the first time in late October, when the cattle drive north needed to cut through the creek bend to water before the final push. He came with two hands, a young man named Creddy, and an older Mexican-American cowhand named Domingo who had worked with Walter for 5 years and knew cattle the way other men know scripture. Irene had been expecting them, and she had been telling herself for 3 weeks that she was not expecting them specifically, only the arrangement. She was mending harness on the porch when the 3 riders came across the north field, and she watched them with the studied casualness of a woman who has been watching for something she will not admit to watching for. Walter had ridden ahead of his hands and pulled up at the porch fence with the same removal of his hat that she was beginning to understand was a specific thing he did for her. "Mrs. Talmadge," he said. "Mr. Shelby." She kept her hands on the harness. "The north gate is open. Creek is running well. You should have no trouble." "Thank you." He paused. "I brought something." He reached into his saddlebag and produced a paper-wrapped parcel from the dry goods store. "The children, I thought, it is just candy." He stopped. I did not know if that was appropriate. It was such an earnest and uncertain gesture that Irene felt something inside her chest do something she was not ready for. She set the harness down and stood up. "That was kind," she said. Sarah appeared in the doorway as if summoned, because she had been watching through the window with the focused attention of a 9-year-old who has sensed something interesting. Owen pushed past her and stood on the edge of the porch with his boots untied and his hair needing combing, looking at the horses with the open worship of a 6-year-old boy. "Are those your horses?" Owen asked Walter directly, the social caution of adults having not yet reached him. "They are," Walter said, with the same gravity he used with adults. "The gray one is very good," Owen said. "His name is Percival," Walter said. "He thinks very highly of himself." Owen appeared to find this an extremely satisfactory answer. He looked at his mother. "Can I pet it?" "May I?" Irene corrected automatically. "He would not object," Walter said. Owen had been helping water the horses at the creek within 20 minutes, trailing behind Domingo with the confident helpfulness of a child who has decided he is entirely necessary to an operation. And Domingo, who had 6 grandchildren and the patience of geography, had accepted this arrangement with a serious nod that Owen clearly interpreted as professional acknowledgement. Walter had unsaddled Percival near the fence, and Irene had brought out a jug of water and 2 cups without thinking about it and handed him one, and they had stood by the porch in the early evening sun talking about the creek level and the cattle, and then, gradually, about other things. He asked about the property, and she found herself telling him things she had not intended to tell anyone. About the spring she had put in alone because the well cover had rotted during the winter, and she had not had money to hire someone. About the time Owen had wandered off in July, and she had found him half a mile north sitting in the tall grass talking to a prairie dog. He listened the way some people read with his full attention, not waiting for his turn to speak. She asked about his operation and he told her about the 7 years of it, about the first winter when he had been living in a dugout he had made himself while he built the house, about losing half his first herd in an ice storm in '73, about the patience of rebuilding from the margin upward. "You came here from where?" she asked. "Missouri," he said. "Before that, Virginia. My family's land was, the war did what the war does." He paused. "I came west because I thought if I was going to start again, I would rather start somewhere that did not already have the shape of everything I had lost built into it." "I understand that," Irene said, and meant it. He looked at her for a moment. "Where did you and your husband come from?" "Ohio," she said. "Thomas wanted land of his own. He was the second son, and the farm would go to his brother. He came west the year we were married, and I followed 6 months later once he had the house framed." She paused. "He was a good man. He worked himself too hard, and he caught a fever when he was already depleted, and it went into his lungs." She was quiet for a moment. "I was angry for a long time." "Not at him, just angry." "At the unfairness of it," Walter said, not as a question. "Yes," she said, "exactly that." Creddy and Domingo and Owen came back from the creek in the fading light, and Owen had creek mud up to his knees and an expression of profound satisfaction. Walter had called the hands together, and they had made camp at the north end of the property with her permission, and Irene had fed her children supper in the warm kitchen and told Sarah, who was watching her with the infuriating perception of a clever 9-year-old, that there was nothing of note to observe. "He is very polite," Sarah said, with the neutrality of a scientist. "Many people are polite," Irene said. "He called Owen son when he was helping with the horses," Sarah said. "Not in a way like he was pretending, in a way like he just forgot and said it." Irene had no answer for this and told Sarah it was time for bed. She stood at the kitchen window for a long time after the children were asleep, looking at the small fire at the north end of the property, and she felt the shape of the confusion in her chest more clearly now, and she acknowledged to herself, quietly and with some trepidation, that it was not confusion at all. It was the beginning of something. She pushed away from the window and went to bed and told herself she was a practical woman with children and a property and a water rights lease, and absolutely no business feeling the things she was feeling. She felt them anyway. The cattle drive moved on the next morning, and Walter had come to the porch to say goodbye, and Owen had cried briefly and been embarrassed about it. And Sarah had handed Walter a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a drawing she had made of Percival the gray horse, rendered in pencil with impressive accuracy. Walter had looked at it for a long moment and then folded it very carefully and put it in his breast pocket next to his heart, which Irene had watched him do and then looked away from quickly. "Thank you, Miss Talmadge," he had said to Sarah. "You may call me Sarah," Sarah had said with the graciousness of someone granting a significant favor. "Thank you, Sarah," he had said. He had looked at Irene last and held the look for a moment longer than was strictly transactional. "April," he said. "April," she agreed, which was when the next cattle movement would bring him back. It was the beginning of November. April was 5 months away. Irene thought about this fact approximately once per day for the next 6 weeks before she decided that was not a healthy relationship to a calendar and made herself stop counting. She managed for 2 weeks and then started again. November passed into a hard December, and Caldwell was the kind of cold that had teeth in it. The wind off the plains carrying ice in it, that bit through wool and made outdoor work a negotiation between what needed to be done and what the body could be convinced to endure. Irene kept the cattle. She still had a modest herd of 14, in the south pasture near the barn, and spent mornings hauling water from the well to the stock tank and evenings mending and reading to her children by the stove. It was in the second week of December that Burl Ackerman made his first move. He came to the property in the afternoon on a day Irene was splitting wood in the yard, 2 men riding with him who were the kind of men who are hired for their size rather than their conversation. Ackerman himself was a heavy man in his middle 50s, with a jaw like a shelf and the specific self-assurance of someone who has rarely been told no. "Mrs. Talmadge," he said from the saddle, "I have come to make you an offer on this property." "The property is not for sale," she said, and drove the axe into the next piece of wood. "I think if you consider the offer seriously, the property is not for sale, Mr. Ackerman." She set another piece on the block. "I believe I was clear." "A woman alone in winter with 2 children," he said, and the words were not quite a threat but were arranged in the shape of one, "can face some difficult circumstances." Irene put the axe down and looked at him directly. "Are you making a threat, Mr. Ackerman? Because if you are, I would encourage you to think carefully about whether that is how you want this conversation to go. I have a rifle in that house and I know how to use it, and this county has a sheriff who, while imperfect, does not care for certain kinds of behavior." The two hired men exchanged a look. Ackerman smiled at her, but the smile did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "I am simply saying that the winter can be hard. If you change your mind about the offer, you know where to find me." He rode away. Irene stood very still until they had gone out of sight around the north tree line, and then she walked to the woodpile and split 4 more pieces in rapid succession until her arms ached and her breathing had normalized. She considered, briefly, writing to Walter about Ackerman's visit. She then considered why she had considered this and felt the absurdity of it. She had known the man for 2 months, and the terms of their relationship were a water rights lease, not anything that entitled her to call him in times of trouble. She was not someone who called men in times of trouble. She was someone who handled things. She handled it. She spoke to Sheriff Cutter, a practical man with a large mustache who listened to her account and wrote Ackerman's name in his notepad and said he would have a word. She also asked me Dupree, whose brother ran the hardware store and whose husband had died 4 years ago in a very similar fashion to Thomas, whether she had had any similar visits from Ackerman. Me had, 3 years prior. She had sold. She still did not sound entirely settled about it. "He will keep pushing," me said. "That is his method. He pushes until you give or until someone bigger pushes back." "Then I suppose I will need to be immovable," Irene said. Me looked at her with affectionate exasperation. "Irene, you are the most immovable person I have ever known. But immovable and invulnerable are different things." Christmas came with a foot of snow and Sarah, and Owen had a modest celebration with a turkey Irene had been fattening since October and small gifts that Irene had been making and saving for months. A rag doll for Sarah that had Sarah's dark hair replicated in embroidery thread, and a carved horse for Owen that Irene had spent 3 weeks working on in the hours after the children slept. Owen immediately named the carved horse Percival, and this information settled in Irene's chest with a warmth she chose not to examine. The new year came in cold and clear, and with it a shift in Irene's circumstances that she had not anticipated. The dry goods merchant, a man named Fletcher, offered her work 3 days a week keeping his accounts. He had discovered, through the small-town intelligence of Caldwell, that she had schooled herself in arithmetic and kept meticulous ledgers for the farm, and his previous bookkeeper had gone east with his new wife and left Fletcher with a pile of receipts and no system. Irene took the work. It was $3 a week and she needed $3 a week, and beyond the money it meant she was in town 3 days out of 7, which meant she heard things, and in a town like Caldwell, hearing things was its own form of protection. One of the things she heard in February was that Ackerman had been making inquiries about the legal status of the water rights lease on the Talmadge property specifically, whether it could be challenged if the property changed hands involuntarily. This reached her through Fletcher, who had heard it from the land agent at the small hotel where the man was staying before he returned to Wichita, and she had thanked Fletcher in her most neutral voice and walked home through the February cold with her thoughts moving fast and deliberate. That evening she sat down and wrote a letter, not to the sheriff, not to her brother in Wichita, to Walter Shelby. She wrote it 3 times before she was satisfied with the tone, which was businesslike and specific, and said exactly what she needed to say without saying the things she was not ready to say. She wrote that she had reason to believe Ackerman was investigating the legal validity of their arrangement, that she thought he should be aware, and that she had no wish to cause him trouble but felt he had a right to the information given that his name was on the document. She sent it with the post rider on a Wednesday. Walter arrived at her door on the Saturday. She had not expected him to come in person. She had expected a letter, perhaps, or a message through a third party. She had not expected him to ride 8 miles in February cold with ice in the air, and knock on her door at 10 in the morning looking windburned and absolutely purposeful. She opened the door and looked at him and felt something rearrange itself in her chest with a click she could practically hear. "Mr. Shelby," she said. "Mrs. Talmadge," he said, "I got your letter. I want to see a man I know in Wichita, a lawyer. He says the lease is airtight. Ackerman cannot challenge it regardless of what happens to the property because it is a land use contract between private parties and it transfers with the deed. He paused. I also want to see Ackerman. She blinked. You want to see Ackerman? I told him that any further attempts to intimidate you would result in me making the story of the arranged auction public in the Wichita Eagle, Walter said. I was clear that I had enough evidence to make the story credible even if not provable in court, and that his business reputation in 3 counties would not survive the telling of it. Irene stared at him. That was a significant risk you took on my behalf, she said. Yes, he said. There was no apology in his voice. I did not ask you to do that, she said. No, he agreed. You did not. She looked at him for a long moment in the cold February doorway. Her children were at the kitchen table behind her. She could hear Owen arguing with himself about something and Sarah making the specific sound of a child trying to eavesdrop without appearing to. Come in, she said. It is cold. He came in, removing his hat and coat, and Owen immediately abandoned whatever he had been doing and attached himself to Walter's arm with the specificity of a child who has made a decision about a person. Did you bring Percival? Owen asked. He is at the fence, Walter said. Owen was out the door in his socks before Irene could say a word about boots, and Sarah slid off her chair with more dignity and followed at a measured pace that did not at all resemble running. Irene was left in the kitchen with Walter Shelby and the smell of bread she had set to rise that morning, and a silence that was unexpectedly comfortable. Sit down, she said. I will make coffee. He sat, and she moved around the kitchen with a deliberateness she hoped did not betray the fact that her hands were not entirely steady, and after a while she brought the coffee to the table and sat across from him, and they talked. They talked for 3 hours. Not about Ackerman, not about legal documents. They talked about everything that was real, about the nature of the plains winter, about the particular loneliness of running a property on your own, about what you hold on to when the practical reasons for holding on have been stripped away. He told her about his brother back in Missouri, a good man, the eldest, who wrote rarely and worked hard and was the only family he had left. She told him about her mother in Ohio, who wrote monthly and always enclosed a packet of seeds with her letters, as if seeds were a form of faith. At some point the children came back inside, tracked with cold and bright-eyed, and Owen climbed onto the bench next to Walter and ate his lunch with the calm certainty of someone sitting next to a fixture of the landscape. And Walter had moved over to make room without being asked, without any particular notice, just naturally, the way you make room for someone who belongs. Irene had watched this and then looked at her coffee cup for a long time. He left in the late afternoon when the light was going golden and thin, and at the door he had turned back and said, Mrs. Talmadge, I would like to call on you, in a formal sense, if you were willing. She had been looking at the middle button of his coat, which was a thing she did when she was not ready to meet a person's eyes, and she had made herself look up. I think, she said carefully, that I would be willing. He had nodded once, and there was something in his face that she thought might be the expression of a man who had been holding his breath for some time and had just been given permission to breathe. He had come back the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and the Saturday after that. The rhythm of it became a thing Irene's week was organized around, even though she was careful not to admit this to herself except in private. He always brought something small, not grand gestures but specific ones. A paper of dried sage because she had mentioned her mother used it. A length of good rope because she had mentioned the old one was fraying. A children's book he had found at the dry goods store in Wichita when he had made a supply trip, which Owen received with the reverence due to sacred texts, and Sarah had politely waited to read until Owen had finished. He was easy to be around, which was not something Irene had expected from a man who was so inherently still. There was no performance in him, no effort to be charming, no playing at gallantry. He was simply present and attentive and honest, and she found over those Saturdays that her fundamental wariness of being observed, of being known, was dismantling itself around him with a thoroughness she found alternately terrifying and deeply relieving. March arrived with a week of unseasonable warmth that brought the creek up and turned the south pasture green, and on a Saturday in the middle of the month Irene and Walter walked the perimeter of the north field together, because she wanted to check the fence line before the spring planting, and he had been describing the herd movement he was planning for April, and they had been talking about the practical things, the fence posts, and the creek level and the calving season. Until they reached the cottonwood stand near the north bend where she had stopped the wagon in October, and they both fell quiet. "I stopped here," she said, "after the auction." "I know," he said. "I followed you." She looked at him. "You followed me. I wanted to make sure you were not going to." He stopped. "I was not certain how a person goes after something like that. I did not want you to be alone without a choice about it." He paused. "I stayed back. You were sitting very still. I thought you probably needed the quiet more than you needed a person, so I turned around and came back." She thought about herself sitting by the cottonwood stand with her forehead in her hands, believing she was entirely alone, and the strange comfort that moved through her at the knowledge that she had not quite been. "Thank you," she said, "for being there, even at a distance." "I would have come if you needed me to," he said simply. She looked up at him, and the thing she had been careful about for months, the thing she had been managing with the discipline of a woman who has learned that hope is an expensive luxury, rose up in her chest past the point where she could manage it. "Walter," she said. He was already looking at her. In the 5 months of their acquaintance, he had rarely said anything without being sure of it first, and what she saw on his face now was a man who had been sure for a long time and had been waiting with a patience that she recognized as a form of respect for the time she needed to reach the same place. "Irene," he said, just her name. Like it was something he had been saying silently for months and was finally allowed to say out loud. She reached out and took his hand, which was calloused and warm, and he closed his fingers around hers carefully, and they stood in the cottonwood grove in the March sun that was still improbably warm and did not say anything for a while because nothing needed to be said. He kissed her eventually, not urgently, not with any performance of romance, but with the specific sincerity of a man who understands that some things, once done, are permanent and should be treated accordingly. Kissed him back and felt the last of the careful distance she had been maintaining dissolve completely, and was not sorry. "I have children," she said when they had pulled back and were standing with their hands still joined. "I know," he said. "I like your children. Your daughter intimidates me somewhat." "She intimidates everyone," Irene said. "It is actually quite admirable." "It is," he agreed. "She has your exactness." He looked at her. "I am not in a hurry, Irene. I want to be clear about that. I am not asking you for anything faster than you are ready for. I just want to be honest about what I am hoping for." "What are you hoping for?" she asked, because she needed to hear it in plain language. "Everything," he said simply and without drama. She thought about that word and what it contained. "That is a large word," she said. "Yes," he said. "I mean it to be." April came, and with it the cattle movement and Creddy and Domingo and the organized chaos of moving a herd across the north bend of Bluff Creek. Owen was in the thick of it from the first morning, with Domingo's patient tolerance and Creddy's somewhat less patient but good-natured tolerance. And Sarah made very precise observations about the cattle from the fence, and relayed them to Walter with the gravity of a consulting expert. And Walter received this information seriously, and once acted on one of her suggestions, which resulted in Sarah's expression being the closest thing to pure joy Irene had seen on her daughter's face in a long time. In the evenings, with the hands camped at the north end and the children in bed, Walter had sat on the porch with Irene in the cool April dark, and they had talked and not talked in equal measure, and the particular silences between them had become the most eloquent form of communication she had ever experienced. On the last evening, when the herd would move north in the morning and he would be gone again for weeks on the drive, He had sat forward in his chair with his elbows on his knees and looked at her with the directness that was the core of him. "When I come back from the drive," he said, "I would like to speak with you more formally, about what comes after." She had her coffee cup in both hands and she turned it slowly. "You mean a question," she said. "I mean a question," he confirmed. "I will be here," she said. He came back in late May, trail-thin and brown deeper, and with the contained energy of a man who has been moving for weeks and is glad to stop. He came to the property first, before he went to his own place, and she had seen him riding across the north field and had set the washboard down and dried her hands on her apron and walked to meet him at the gate. He had dismounted and stood looking at her with Percival shifting behind him and the late May sky enormous and pale blue overhead, and said, "I have been thinking for 2 months about how to say this properly." "And," she said, "I have not improved it significantly," he said, "so I am going to say it plainly. Irene Talmadge, I love you. I love your children and I love your stubbornness and I love the way you argue about things you are right about, which is most things. I would like to marry you if you will have me, and I would like us to build something together that belongs to both of us." She had known this was coming. She had been turning it over in her mind for 2 months in the parallel way, shaping her own answer, testing it, making sure of it. She was a careful woman and she had not come to certainty easily, but she had come to it. "Yes," she said, "I will have you." He had crossed the few feet between them, and she had gone up on her toes, and he had caught her and held her with both arms, and she had pressed her face against the side of his neck and felt, for the first time since February of 1878, the specific warmth of not being alone in a weight that had been very heavy. She was crying, she realized. Quietly and without drama, the way she did everything she felt deeply. "I did not want to make you cry," he said into her hair. "I know," she said. "These are the good kind." Sarah had been watching from the porch, which was not a surprise. What was a surprise was that she had gone back inside and woken Owen from his nap and told him, apparently in some detail, that things were going to be different now and they were both going to be fine about it. This account was reported to Irene by Owen that evening, who seemed satisfied with the arrangement and primarily wanted to know if Percival would live at their farm. Walter had taken Owen seriously, as he always did. "Percival and I go together," he said. "Where I am, he is. So yes." Owen had gone to bed so satisfied with this information that he had forgotten to require the usual 3 glasses of water. They were married in July of 1880, at the small church on the east side of Caldwell, by a minister named Reverend Bates, who was so moved by the proceedings that his voice broke twice, and he had to compose himself. Me Dupree was there, weeping openly and making no apologies. Domingo had come in from the ranch in a clean shirt and his good hat, which Irene had never seen before and which was magnificent. Creddy had come as well, awkward in town clothes and grinning. Sheriff Cutter, who had developed a respect for Irene Talmadge over the preceding year, attended and stood in the back with his hat in his hands. Irene wore a dress she and me had made over the preceding 3 weeks from fabric she had chosen specifically. A deep blue that me said brought out the quality of her eyes, which was information Irene had received with dismissive practicality and then incorporated into her choice of fabric. Walter was in his best coat, which was dark brown wool and fit him very well, and he had been waiting at the front of the church with a stillness that was so characteristic of him that it looked almost like calm, until you noticed that he was watching the church door with the specific intensity of a man who cannot quite believe what he is waiting for. When she had come through that door on me's arm, her brother had in the end not been able to make the journey from Wichita. He had looked at her with an expression so unguarded and so full of something she could only call devotion that she had stopped walking for a single moment, just to hold the image of it. Me had pressed her arm gently and she had walked forward. The ceremony was brief and specific and real, and when the minister said the words and Walter slid the plain gold ring onto her finger, his hand had been entirely steady, and hers had been entirely steady, and she had thought that they were perhaps the most well-matched pair in the territory. They had celebrated at Mee's house with food enough for twice the number of people, and at some point in the evening Sarah had gone to sleep on Domingo's shoulder with the unceremonious efficiency of a child who has decided the adult is trustworthy. And Domingo had sat very still for the duration rather than disturb her, which Irene thought was one of the more charming things she had seen in her life. They made the decision together, in the practical and unsentimental manner that was their nature, to base their combined operation at the Talmadge property, which was larger and had the water access, and to bring Walter's cattle herd to join Irene's smaller one. Walter's house, 8 miles south, was sold to a young homesteader couple in September for a fair price, and the Talmadge property was recorded at the county clerk's office under both their names, Walter and Irene Shelby. The sight of her name changed on that document had given Irene a complex feeling that she had stood within the county clerk's hallway for several minutes, a grief for the previous name, which had been Thomas's name, and which she had carried through some very hard years, and a rightness about the new one that was undeniable. She had allowed herself both feelings simultaneously and considered it a form of honesty. Ackerman had made no further moves on the property after Walter's visit in February. He was heard to say uncharitable things about the Shelbys in the saloon on 2 occasions, but opinion in Caldwell had largely moved against him in the intervening months, as rumors of the arranged auction had circulated in the way that rumors in small towns always eventually do, and his public support had the uncomfortable quality of applause from people who would prefer to be elsewhere. The autumn of 1880 was good. The combined herd had a successful drive, managed largely by Walter with Domingo and Creddy, and a new hand named Voss who had come recommended from a neighboring ranch, and the income was the best the Talmadge land had generated since Thomas's gambling year in 1877. Irene continued her bookkeeping work for Fletcher 3 days a week, and applied the careful accounting she used on Fletcher's books to the ranch's finances. And Walter, who was gifted with cattle and land and not especially gifted with ledgers, had handed this over to her with the specific relief of a man being handed down a heavy thing he has been carrying at an awkward angle. Sarah, at 11 now, was learning to ride competently and had developed a fierce interest in the arithmetic of cattle breeding that Walter had encouraged with complete seriousness, providing her with the figures from previous year's records and discussing them with her at supper in a way that made Owen feel briefly left out, until Walter had included him in a conversation about fence construction, and Owen had decided this was actually better. The children had adjusted to Walter with the particular adaptability of children who are secure in their mother's love, and have therefore room in their hearts for additional good people. It had not been instant. Sarah had observed for months before she had committed, and Owen had committed more quickly but tested the commitment with the subtle probing of a child making sure of footing before putting full weight down. Walter had passed both tests with a naturalness that Irene thought was the best evidence of who he actually was, because a person who is performing goodness eventually shows the seams, and Walter had no seams she had ever been able to find. He had sat with Owen through a week of nightmares in October. The boy went through them periodically, and it had always been Irene who sat in the dark of his room and held his hand until he settled. When it happened in October the first time, Irene had started from bed and Walter had already been sitting up, and he had said quietly, "I can go if you like, or you can sleep. Either is fine," and she had seen the offer for what it was, a choice given to her, not a thing taken over, and she had said, "Together then," and they had both gone. Owen had woken in his room to find both of them there, and had produced an expression of such total satisfaction that the nightmares had resolved after 3 nights and had not returned. In December of 1880, Irene told Walter she was expecting, and he had sat with this information for a moment, looking at her with that particular quality of attention he had when something was moving through him more deeply than his surface showed. Then he had crossed the kitchen and held her face in both hands and said, "Irene," just her name again, but with the full weight of everything he was feeling behind it. "You are pleased," she said. "I am more than pleased," he said. "I do not have a word for this." Sarah had been told first, with care, because she was the eldest and she was perceptive and she deserved the first knowledge. She had listened to her mother explain, and then she had nodded slowly and said, "Will it be a boy or a girl?" And when Irene said she didn't know yet, Sarah had said, with great authority, that she supposed either would be acceptable. Owen had received the news with the straightforward delight of someone to whom more people simply means more people, and had immediately proposed names with a creativity that Irene had noted was entertaining but perhaps not practical. The winter of 1881 was a working winter, the kind you look back on as having been full of cold and firelight, and the warm kitchen, and the long evenings with work spread on the table and the children doing lessons or drawing or reading, and Walter's voice low, and even when he read aloud, which he had started doing in November, and which had become the evening rhythm of the house. He read from the Bible sometimes, and sometimes from newspapers, and occasionally from the books that made their way to Caldwell through the dry goods store or the occasional passing traveler who would trade reading material for a meal. Irene had told him one evening in January, watching him read to Owen, who was half asleep against his arm, that she had not known this was something she had been wanting. The specific shape of this, the children and the fire and this man's voice in the room. "What did you think you were wanting?" he asked. "I thought I was wanting to survive," she said. "I had gotten very good at wanting only practical things." "And now," he said, she had looked at the fire for a moment. "Now I want all the impractical things as well," she said, "and that is somewhat terrifying." "I know," he said, "but you are extremely well positioned to manage terrifying things." She had laughed, which she did more often now than she had in years, and the sound of it had made Owen stir and settle and Sarah look up from her book with the small, satisfied expression of someone who is keeping a private record and noting an important entry. The baby was born in August of 1881, in the Talmadge Shelby house with me Dupree and the doctor from Caldwell both present, on a morning when the sun came through the east window and made the floorboards warm. It was a boy. A healthy, loud, immediately opinionated boy whom they named James Thomas Shelby, James for Walter's father, who had died in the war, and Thomas for Irene's first husband, because that name deserved to continue, and she had said so, and Walter had agreed without a moment's hesitation, which she thought was one of the finest things he had ever done. Owen had been allowed into the room first, and had inspected the baby with the critical eye of a senior sibling, and declared him acceptable. Sarah had held him with the concentration of someone performing a delicate task, and had looked up and said, quietly, "Hello, James. I am Sarah. I will teach you everything you need to know." This had made me cry into her handkerchief, which she had been doing at intervals throughout the morning. Walter had held his son with the same precision he held everything he valued carefully, both hands full attention, and had been so quiet that Irene, exhausted and profoundly satisfied, had said, "Are you all right?" He had looked at her, and she had seen that he was better than all right. He was a man standing at the exact center of everything he had ever wanted, and he knew it, and the knowledge had made him utterly still. "Yes," he said, "I am very much all right." The years that followed were years of building, in the way that good years are, not without difficulty, not without loss, but cumulatively and irreversibly accumulative. The ranch grew. The herd improved under the combined intelligence of Walter's animal knowledge and Irene's financial management, and by 1883 they were among the more prosperous operations in the Caldwell area, which was not a gaudy prosperity but a real and solid one that was based on actual work rather than speculation. James grew from a loud, opinionated baby into a loud, opinionated toddler, and then, without anyone quite tracking how it happened, a boy of 4 who had his father's patience and his mother's stubbornness, in a combination that Walter said was either going to make him a remarkable man or an exceptional problem. Owen, at 11 now, had taken to ranch work with the completeness of someone who has found their calling, and rode well and worked hard, and had the beginning of a man's judgment beginning to appear behind the boy's face. He still sometimes called Walter Sir out of habit and sometimes called him Pa without thinking, and Walter received both with equal ease, which was perhaps the most accurate portrait of him Irene knew. Sarah had turned 14 in 1883 and was the sharpest-minded person at the Caldwell school, a fact that her teacher, a patient woman named Miss Alcott, reported with enthusiasm and a slight degree of personal challenge. Sarah was interested in figures and law and the running of the ranch in proportions that suggested a young woman who would do significant things, and Irene had begun corresponding with women's colleges in the East with a specific and practical focus that the letter recipients seemed to find simultaneously refreshing and formidable. In the spring of 1884, Irene discovered she was expecting again, which she reported to Walter on a Thursday evening with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone who has learned that news is received best when given directly. Walter had been looking at ledgers. He was improving at ledgers under her tutelage, and he had looked up and she had seen the same quality of response as the first time, the deep and unperformative joy of it, and he had said, "How are you feeling?" "Practical," she said, "and also pleased." "That seems exactly right," he said. This child was a girl, born in November of 1884 during a cold snap that put ice on the inside of the windows, and required Walter to stoke the kitchen stove to a heat that made the room tropical. She was small and dark-haired, and arrived with a remarkable composure that the doctor found unsettling and Irene found completely characteristic of the family. They named her Rose, for no particular historical reason except that both of them had said it at the same moment when the conversation of names arose, and had looked at each other and known. Rose Shelby was adored from her first breath. James, who was 3, approached her with the aggressive affection of a small animal encountering something smaller, and had to be monitored. Owen was by then 12, and had developed a big brother manner with James that he extended immediately and naturally to Rose. Sarah, at 16, held her sister with the same careful precision she had used with James, and had said simply, "Hello, Rose, I am Sarah. Same as before, I will teach you everything." The years of 1885 and 1886 were good years for the range, with steady rain and fair cattle prices, and the Shelby Ranch, as it was known now in the county, though Irene had insisted, and won the argument that the legal name of the property remained Talmadge Shelby in honor of the work her first husband had put into the land, had expanded to take in an additional 80 acres of adjoining property to the east. Purchased fairly from a homesteader who had decided the plains were not his particular life, and had gone back to Pennsylvania without rancor. Gerard Hollies had left Caldwell in 1882, the bank having been sold to a regional concern out of Wichita following an examination of his lending practices that had produced results sufficiently embarrassing that his departure had been less a choice than a conclusion. Irene had heard this news from me with a satisfaction she had allowed herself privately and not commented on publicly, because she was not a person who celebrated the misfortunes of others, even misfortunes she thought were merited. Burl Ackerman had died in the winter of 1883 of a heart attack in his own barn, which was not a fate Irene would have wished on him, but was not one she had mourned with any particular depth. He had spent his last years making increasingly poor cattle investments, and his land had been sold in sections to various neighboring operations, including a small section with good creek access that Walter had purchased at a public auction, a fair and openly conducted one, which had struck Irene as a satisfying symmetry. In 1887, Sarah Talmadge, at 19 years old, left Caldwell for a school in St. Louis that had accepted her on the basis of a portfolio of work that her teacher Miss Alcott had described in her recommendation as evidence of a mind that the territory could not contain, a phrase that had made Irene simultaneously proud beyond bearing and aware of a specific loneliness already forming at the prospect of her eldest child's departure. Walter had driven Sarah to the stage in Caldwell with the whole family, Irene, Owen, James, and Rose, and Sarah had said her goodbyes in the specific way she did everything, with precision and without excessive display. But when she had embraced her mother at the end, she had held on longer than expected and said quietly into Irene's shoulder, "I am going because you showed me I could. I hope you know that." Irene had held her daughter's face and memorized it one more time and said, "I know. Go learn everything." She had not cried until the stage had been out of sight for 5 minutes, and then she had cried in the most private and complete way she knew, which was briefly and entirely, and then finished. Walter had said nothing on the drive home for a while, and then had reached across the wagon bench and taken her hand and held it for the rest of the journey. Owen, at 17, was by 1889 indispensable to the ranch in the way that a person is indispensable when they have spent a decade growing up inside a thing and become structurally part of it. He had the kind of natural skill with cattle that Domingo recognized as a gift and had been quietly encouraging for years, and he had Walter's stillness when he worked, the same economy of motion and patience with animals that comes from genuine understanding rather than performance. On an evening in the summer of 1889, Owen had come to the porch where Walter and Irene sat in the long evening light and had sat in the third chair, and after a moment had said carefully that he wanted to say something. They had waited. "I want to say thank you," he said, "to both of you. I know I was 6 when you came, Walter, and I know I did not always make it easy because I was figuring things out. But I want you to know that what you built here, what you both built, is the thing I am most grateful for, and I want to try to build something half as good." Walter had been quiet for a moment and then said, "You are already building it, Owen." Irene had not trusted her voice, so she had reached across and squeezed her son's hand, and he had squeezed back, and they had sat in the summer evening light with the sounds of the ranch around them and the creek in the distance and Rose's small voice somewhere inside the house narrating a game she was playing, and it had been, Irene thought, one of the richest moments of her life. Domingo retired from the active cattle work in 1890, at 72, citing his knees and what he called the general unreasonableness of the Kansas winter, and he had gone to live with his daughter's family in Wichita. But he had come back for a week in the summer of every year he was alive, and he and Walter would sit on the porch in the evenings and talk about cattle in the specific language of men who understand an animal deeply, and James, who was 9 by then, would sit on the porch steps and listen with the attention of someone taking notes. Creddy had married a woman from the neighboring settlement in 1885 and started his own small operation, and had remained a friend in the ongoing way of a man who had been present for the beginning of things and felt entitled to the continuance of the connection. His wife, a forthright woman named Harriet, had become one of Irene's closer friends in the years that followed, arriving at the Shelby place with the regularity of the seasons and the opinions of someone who has no patience for circling the subject. By 1891, James Shelby, at 10 years old, was the specific combination of his parents that Walter had predicted: patient in the field and stubborn at the table, with his father's way with animals and his mother's way with accounts, having independently discovered at 8 that numbers could be arranged to tell stories if you looked at them correctly, an observation that Irene had received with the private satisfaction of someone recognizing a continuation of themselves. Rose, at 6, was her own entirely unclassifiable thing. She had her mother's brown eyes and her father's stillness, and a quality of direct observation that made adults feel they were being accurately assessed. She was interested in horses with a singular focus, and Walter had begun teaching her to ride the previous autumn with the same seriousness he brought to every teaching. Meaning, he had explained the actual mechanics rather than providing a simplified version, because Rose received simplified versions with an expression that indicated she knew they were simplified and was waiting for the rest. Irene, in the spring of 1892, stood in the kitchen of the house that Thomas Talmadge had built and that she had defended and that had become, incrementally and completely, the shape of her life. And she thought about the woman she had been in October of 1879, standing in front of an auction block with $320 in a worn leather pouch. She thought about the bid falling and the room erupting in noise and one man at the back of the room not cheering. She thought about the sound of hooves behind her on the road to the cottonwood stand. She thought about a man who had said simply that he had gone to that auction and done the thing he did because it was right, and because she deserved better than a rigged game. Walter came through the back door from the morning's work, trail dusty and calm, and stopped when he saw her standing at the kitchen counter with her hands still and her expression the particular one she wore when she was thinking something all the way through to the end. "What is it?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Only thinking." "About what?" She turned around and looked at him, this man, this specific and irreplaceable man with the silver at his temples and the familiar lines of his face and the way he filled the room without claiming it. "About the auction," she said. He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her, which was a thing he did when they were talking about something that mattered. He came closer rather than further. "What about it?" he said. "Everyone was celebrating," she said. "All those men, and you were not." "No," he said. "I did not understand it at the time," she said. "I was too," she paused. "I was too broken open by it to see what I was looking at." "And now," he said. She put her hand against his chest, over the breast pocket where he had once put Sarah's drawing of Percival, a pocket she knew now contained his watch and a folded letter from Sarah that had arrived last week from St. Louis. "Now I understand that you were not celebrating because it was not a victory for you, because it was still a loss until you could make it not one." He covered her hand with his. "I did not know you then," he said. "Not really. I knew what I could see. And what I could see was someone who deserved better. You still did not know me," she said, "and you still came after me on that road." "Yes," he said. "Why?" He considered the question with the seriousness he brought to questions he had been thinking about for a long time. "Because I think some things you know before you have the information to explain them," he said. "I knew that watching you walk out of that room was not something I was willing to do without at least trying." She leaned her forehead against his shoulder and felt him wrap his arms around her. And outside the window the Kansas spring was doing what it did, enormous sky, green coming back to the grass, the creek audible in the distance. From upstairs she could hear James and Rose engaged in some ongoing negotiation of unclear nature and the specific sound of Rose refusing to be managed, which she did with a placidity that James found deeply frustrating. "Walter," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am very glad you came after me on that road." "So am I," he said, "every day." In September of 1892, Sarah came home from St. Louis for the autumn, which she had not done in 2 years, and she came with her studies completed, and a certificate of learning that she held with characteristic understatement, and a new quality of settled surety that Irene recognized as what a person looks like when they have found the exact version of themselves they were building toward. She also came with plans. She had been corresponding with Miss Alcott, who was now running a small school attached to the church, and with the County Board of Education, and she had a proposal for a secondary school in Caldwell that would allow the children of the territory, including, specifically, the children of the homesteaders and the Mexican-American families and the remaining native families who had been displaced and were attempting to build new lives along the edges of towns like Caldwell, to access the kind of education that had, until now, been largely a function of privilege and proximity. She laid the proposal on the kitchen table at supper and explained it with the methodical precision that was entirely her mother and the broad and generous vision that was, Irene thought, entirely Sarah. The table had been quiet when she finished, and then Walter had said, What do you need? A building, Sarah said, funding for books, and someone who is willing to say publicly that this is a good thing when the people who think it is not a good thing start making noise. I will say so publicly, Walter said. As will your mother. Yes, Irene confirmed. I thought you would, Sarah said, and the satisfaction in her voice was the satisfaction of someone who has known a thing for a long time and is pleased to have it confirmed. The school was built over the winter of 1892 and opened in the spring of 1893, and the opening was attended by more families than anyone had projected, including a number of families who had not previously felt welcome in Caldwell's public life, and who came with children who were wide-eyed and cautious, and who, within an hour, were doing what children do when given space and materials and someone who takes them seriously. Which is to say, they were working and asking questions and being exactly themselves. Irene had stood at the back of that first morning watching Sarah at the front of the room, and she had thought about seeds, about her mother's letters from Ohio, each one containing a paper packet of seeds folded inside the paper, about what seeds are patience made into an object, the long bet against difficulty that spring will come. Walter had come to stand beside her and had said nothing, which was right. Across the years that followed, the Shelby place was the kind of home that becomes a reference point for the people around it. Creddy and Harriet's children grew up with James and Rose as a loose, extended family. Domingo came every summer until he could not, and then his daughter came in his place, and Walter had given a considerable portion of land along the South Creek to Domingo's grandson, when that young man was ready to start his own place, which had struck the neighboring landowners as remarkable and had struck Walter as simply correct. Owen, at 22 in 1893, had begun a partnership with a young woman named Clara from a farming family 30 miles east, a slow and careful and mutually decided partnership that was the kind of courtship Irene watched with the specific warm recognition of a woman who has conducted one similar herself. He had come to Irene first, in the kitchen in the early morning in the way he had always come to her when he had something important, and had told her about Clara with the economy of a young man trying to contain a large feeling in practical words. Irene had listened and then said, "Bring her here." He had. Clara was a quiet, observant young woman with steady hands and a good sense of humor that she kept close and produced at the right moments, and Irene had found her entirely admirable. Walter had shaken her hand and looked at her with his measuring look, and then turned to Owen and given him a nod that meant everything. The wedding was in the autumn of 1894, and it was the kind of celebration that the Shelby place seemed to generate by now, full of real people who meant it, with food enough and noise enough, and at the end, a quiet that was the quiet of good completion rather than depletion. In the winter of 1894, on an evening when the snow was coming down outside, and the kitchen was warm, and James was at the table doing his mathematics, and Rose was reading in the chair by the stove with her feet tucked under her, and Walter was cleaning tack at the far end of the table, Irene sat with her coffee and looked at the room and felt the fullness of it with a clarity that was almost too much to hold. She had not been looking for this. She had been looking for survival, and then for persistence, and then for justice, and then for a way to keep the land and keep her children and keep her own sense of herself intact. She had not been looking for love because love was something she had already had and lost, and she had not been certain she was entitled to more than one version of it. But it had come anyway, in the form of a quiet man who had stood at the back of a room and not cheered, who had followed her on a road to make sure she was not alone without knowing if she wanted company, who had constructed a water rights lease to let her keep her pride, who had said "I mean everything" and meant it, and who had been standing next to her in every version of this life, the difficult ones and the simple ones and the ordinary extraordinary ones since. She was 45 years old in this kitchen in the winter of 1894, and she was exactly where she was meant to be. Walter looked up from the tack and found her watching him and raised his eyebrows slightly, a question. She shook her head. Nothing. Only gratitude so large she could not say it. He held her look for a moment and then nodded once slowly, which was his version of the same thing, and went back to the tack. James said, without looking up from his mathematics, 5 minus a negative 3 is 8, right? Yes, Walter and Irene said at the same time. James nodded in satisfaction, and Rose turned a page, and the snow came down outside the windows of the Talmadge Shelby house on the Kansas plains in the winter of 1894, and inside it was warm. On the front porch in the spring, there would be 2 chairs. There had always been 2 chairs. There would be letters from Sarah in St. Louis and from Owen and Clara at their own place 30 miles east. There would be James and Rose growing into themselves, growing up and outward and eventually into their own lives, carrying the shape of this place inside them. There would be cattle in the spring moving north across the Bluff Creek bend, the same bend where everything had changed one October. There would be work and difficulty, and the specific pleasures of a life built carefully. There would be Walter at the end of every day, coming through the back door. And Irene turning to look at him. The story of a woman who had stood at an auction block and lost everything and had not understood in that moment that the man at the back of the room who was not celebrating was already, without knowing it yet, in the act of giving it all back and far more than he had bought. She had been the widow. He had been the quiet bidder. And between the hammer's fall and a March afternoon in a cottonwood grove, they had become something neither of them had been looking for, and both of them had needed more than water or land or any practical thing. They had become each other's home. And that home, built on good Kansas ground near a creek called Bluff, under an enormous sky that forgave nothing and gave everything, lasted.